Steve is perhaps the most recognizable and known character in all of gaming. People who have never even played Minecraft or any games in general can recognize him as being the Minecraft guy, one of the faces of Minecraft. So it's quite interesting that despite being so universally known and recognized, the story behind him was only recently uncovered, and for 15 years, his origins were almost entirely unknown. Notch didn't name Steve, he's just as confused as us. So how and when did the most popular character in the world's most popular game get his name? The world of Minecraft would be first graced with the presence of Steve on May the 13th, 2009, mere days after Minecraft would first release in Minecraft pre-classic version RD132328. This was back when Minecraft was simply a small, flat, grass block coated, floating cube-shaped cobblestone island, and all you could do was place and destroy, extremely bare bones. In this update, Notch would first add mobs to the game, which looked like this. Technically, whilst being the first ever mob added to Minecraft, this mob was never given an official name, although it was referred to as zombie in the game's code. 100 would spawn at random positions upon loading and generating a new world. Now, the actual texture for this mob came from another game Notch was working on a few months prior in February of 2009, known as Zombie Town. This game was never released publicly, nor was it ever finished. The only footage we have of it is directly from Notch's now private YouTube channel, where he showcases the game for 16 seconds. You can see in this footage that these same mobs, moving around in the exact same way, are present. Notch actually states that the blocky design for this mob worked well in Minecraft, which is the reason he initially added them. Considering this was seemingly a zombie horror type game, and Notch had also been making other zombie games around this time and prior, it's likely that this texture was actually a zombie, which is interesting as the Minecraft zombie skin has a very similar texture, basically a zombie version of Steve. Anywho, about 2 weeks later on May the 31st, 2009, Minecraft Classic 0.0.15a would release the first version of Minecraft ever with multiplayer compatibility. Because players needed to see other players now, there needed to be a model for the actual player. Notch decided to make the player's model the mob's model, and despite a few changes over the years, including one where Steve would lose his facial hair, that's right, this isn't a smile but his beard, this is the skin that would eventually become the famous face of Minecraft. But up to this point, he still wasn't Steve. Notch never called him Steve, the players never called him Steve. As far as they were aware, he was just the player or the mob. So where did Steve even come from? Well, to figure that out, we're going to have to take a brief detour through Minecraft's obscure history. But first, we're going to take a pit stop at my channel here, where you can subscribe to help me hit 700k subs by the end of the year, and check out my Patreon where you can get exclusive content. No pressure, of course. Anyways, if you are a Minecraft history nerd, you may recognize these characters, or rather models: Beast Boy, Black Steve, and Steve. And yes, those are their actual names. Or are they? Steve and Black Steve would first be seen in another video uploaded by Notch in late January of 2010, being added to Minecraft in-dev as a mob around the same time, with each of the two models being its skin variants. Also, Steve and Black Steve were technically replacing another model named Rana that was added a few days prior. Not long after, Beast Boy would also be added as a third skin variant for this mob. These models were all made by a game designer named Docky, who briefly worked with Notch during in-dev, and it would be revealed about 10 years later that these models were planned for another game which never came to be. These three models were in the game for approximately 2 days, from January the 29th until January the 31st, 2010, where they would then be removed and replaced by the original mob skin again. Anyways, why were these random and seemingly out of place models added, and where did they get their names? Well, as for the first question, we don't exactly know. The models were removed and replaced so soon after their addition that it's theorized that Notch considered switching to this art style for the mobs and player models, but then changed his mind. This does make sense, as the models are still rather blocky and Minecraft shaped, with the key difference being a more animated and expressive art style. As for where they got their names, well, we know Rana was named and created by Docky, but Steve, Black Steve, and Beast Boy were not named by him, nor were they named by Notch or named as such in the game's files. Beast Boy makes sense since, well, it looks like Beast Boy, but Steve and Black Steve, how did they get their names? They were named after the Steve we all know and love, right? That would make sense, and as a matter of fact, up to this point was what everyone believed. But this is where the first discrepancy becomes evident. You see, the first time Notch ever officially referred to Steve, as far as we know at least, is from October the 24th, 2010 on his Tumblr, where right at the bottom, Notch refers to the Minecraft guy as Steve with a question mark. Even here you can see he isn't exactly sure where the name came from, as evidenced by the question mark. It was also around this time that a variety of threads on the forums would pop up acknowledging that the Minecraft guy had been officially named, so it's highly likely that this was where Steve was officially named for the first time. So how was it therefore possible that these mobs were named Steve months before even Steve was named Steve? Well, this is where an anonymous player named A comes into the picture. A was the first person to seemingly notice this discrepancy in the names of these models and decided to do some research of his own. He went through all of Notch and Doc's old social media posts from around the time, attempting to find references to these models or their names, but found nothing. He checked the game's files from the time, they were not named there. Maybe the information was lost to time or deleted, so he started going through old revisions of the Minecraft wiki to see what the older pages had listed and if they had any clues. And that's when he discovered that the models were first referred to as Steve way back in September of 2010, over 1 month before Steve was officially known as Steve. How could this be though? This once again begs the question, how could they be named after someone who wasn't even named yet? A decided to next look through Minecraft IRC logs from the time, which for those of you who are younger, was like an old, extremely primitive version of Discord where all you could do was type to other people. In old IRC logs from not even a day after these models were first added to the game, almost a year before Notch would officially refer to Steve as Steve, players were already calling these models Steve, Black Steve and Beast Boy. And the first player known to refer to these models as Steve, that wouldn't be Notch, but a player here named Xiao, who would comment, "So I'm not the only one that thinks Black Steve is pantless," mentioning so because of the Black Steve model, due to the color of his skin being the same as the costume he and Steve wore, looked like he wasn't wearing any pants. As for why he decided to even refer to this mob as Steve in the first place, we do not know. But only 2 messages after, a player named Tuz would state that the term Black Steve has been coined and that was now his name. Players were quick to take a liking to the Steve name clearly. The same player would then refer to the other model as White Steve about 15 minutes later, who would eventually become known as just Steve not long after. A player named Snowman's message here being the first to refer to him as simply Steve. From then on in that same IRC channel, you can see a variety of people mentioning Steve and Black Steve to refer to these new models. But what's even more interesting is that Notch himself was in this IRC channel actively talking about the newest update, as he regularly did so at the time. And right here, where a player mentions mapping the skins for the Steves, another player confusingly asks, Steves? Where they then receive clarification that this is referring to the model for the game's new mobs, the Black and White Steve. This player then sends a message saying Steve and Steve, likely talking about the hilarity in the name of the mobs, to which Notch actually saw, replying with the message no and no. We don't know if Notch was actually replying to this message or the one above about skinning swords, but if Notch was in fact referring to the Steve message, maybe he was saying he disliked the name. That's just speculation though, and regardless, you can clearly see that right here in this IRC channel, Notch would first read and acknowledge the messages where the players called the model Steve. So that's where the name Steve came from, but when did the Steve we all know and love take up the same name as well? Well, if you search the Minecraft forums for the word Steve, you can find a variety of posts and comments from early 2010 referencing Steve. Here's a post where a player asked a question about the names of the new mobs, and one of the first comments from only a couple days after the IRC conversation took place was already officially calling the characters Beast Boy Steve, White Steve, and Black Steve. Players would even mourn the loss of the 3 mobs when they were removed only 2 days later. But then for a period of time, there weren't really mentions of Steve anymore. The few times Steve was mentioned, it was still referring to the 2 models. In August of 2010, we can see on the forums that a few people had maybe begun referring to the player as Steve now, but these references were still rather ambiguous. Players would also sometimes refer to sheep and other mobs in the game as Steve as well, making it even harder to distinguish when the name Steve began being used solely to refer to the player. In fact, there were more mentions about Steve the Slime, some random early Minecraft player Slime who unfortunately died than there were to actual Steve. I think that probably the first absolutely clear time Steve was referred to as Steve on the forums was in this post here, where a player directly refers to making a different version of the Steve skin. There are also some creepypastas from around the same time which had a character named Steve in them. For the most part, it seemed like the name was fading into obscurity. More players knew of Steve the damn slime than actual Steve. Fortunately though, in October when Notch would make his Tumblr post officially naming Steve, likely due to him recalling people referring to the mobs as Steve in that fateful IRC channel 9 months prior, it finally became known as to what the name of the character was. People generally liked the name, simple but straightforward, and from then on, the Minecraft guy was Steve. Interestingly, Snowman, the original player to first use the standalone name Steve, would comment on this in an IRC channel the same day, mentioning that Steve was Doc's dude and was not meant to be the Minecrafter. So, the Steve we all know and love, the Steve who would later become potentially the most recognizable character in all of gaming, was actually named after some random testing models that were only in super early versions of the game for 2 days, which in of themselves were randomly named by a player named Xiao, who for the most part has been inactive on the internet since 2014, meaning that we probably won't ever know why he decided to randomly refer to these models as Steve. Ironic how one random throwaway message in an old IRC channel had such a huge impact on Minecraft as a whole. Check out my Patreon for exclusive content, be sure to subscribe to help me reach 700k subs by the end of the year. Thank you all so much for watching.